Have you ever felt like something was missing from the spiritual teachings you grew up with? Like there was a deeper truth hiding just beneath the surface, waiting to be discovered? What if I told you that for almost 2,000 years, we've only been hearing half the story of Christianity? What if the most profound spiritual truths were deliberately hidden from us, locked away by those who feared losing their power over our souls? Imagine it's 1945. The world is recovering from war, and in the remote desert of Egypt, a farmer is digging for fertilizer. His shovel hits something hard, a clay jar, ancient, sealed. When he cracks it open, he has no idea he's about to unleash secrets that will shake the very foundations of organized religion. Inside that jar were texts that had been buried for centuries, spiritual writing so revolutionary, so threatening to established authority, that they were branded as heretical and ordered destroyed. These weren't just any books. These were the lost voices of early Christians who experienced something completely different from what we're taught today. They spoke of finding God within yourself, not through priests or churches. They described Jesus not as a distant savior to worship, but as a teacher showing you how to awaken your own divine nature. They revealed that salvation isn't about following rules or fearing judgment. It's about remembering who you truly are. These are the Gnostic Gospels, and their rediscovery changes everything. Why were these texts buried? What did they contain that was so dangerous? And most importantly, what do they reveal about your own spiritual potential that you've never been told? If you've ever felt that authentic spirituality transcends buildings and dogma, if you've sensed there's more to your existence than what meets the eye, then what we're about to explore together might just transform how you see yourself and your relationship with the divine forever. Chapter 1. The Nag Hammadi Discovery. Imagine being told your entire life that there's only one way to connect with the divine, one path, one truth, one interpretation. Then imagine discovering that for over 1,000 years, entire libraries of spiritual wisdom were deliberately erased from history. How would that make you feel? Betrayed, curious, ready for answers. This is exactly what happened to humanity's spiritual heritage. For centuries, we lived in a carefully constructed bubble, believing that the Christianity we knew was the only Christianity that ever existed. But what if I told you that in the beginning, spirituality was wild, diverse, and beautifully experimental? What if early seekers explored dozens of different ways to understand Jesus, God, and their own divine nature? That world existed, and then it was systematically destroyed. But here's where the story gets incredible. Sometimes the universe has a way of bringing truth back to light, no matter how deeply it's buried. Picture a simple Egyptian farmer in December 1945. His name was Muhammad al-Saman, and he was just trying to find some fertilizer for his crops near the dusty cliffs of Nag Hammadi. The world had just survived a devastating war. People everywhere were searching for meaning, for hope, for something to believe in again. Muhammad's shovel struck something hard buried in the ancient earth. A massive clay jar, sealed and forgotten. Now, if you grew up hearing stories about genies and curses, would you open it? For a moment, he hesitated. Local legends whispered warnings about disturbing such things. But something deeper called to him, that same curiosity that lives in all of us when we sense we're on the edge of discovery. When he cracked open that jar, the world changed forever. Inside weren't gold coins or precious stones. Instead, he found 13 leather bound books, their pages carefully wrapped and preserved for almost 1,600 years. These weren't just any books, they were a secret library, spiritual texts that had been hidden from the world since the 4th century, when powerful religious authorities decided which teachings humanity was allowed to hear and which had to disappear. Think about that for a moment. Someone, centuries ago, loved these writings so much they risked everything to hide them, hoping that someday someone like you would be ready to hear their message. What Muhammad held in his weathered hands were over 50 texts with names that would make religious scholars' hearts race. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Sophia of Jesus Christ. These weren't watered-down versions of familiar stories. These were radical, mystical accounts that painted a completely different picture of Jesus, of creation, of what it means to be human. But here's what will blow your mind. These texts belonged to the Gnostics, the very spiritual rebels who had been branded as dangerous heretics and supposedly wiped from history. Except they weren't wiped out. They were just waiting. Among these rediscovered treasures was something extraordinary, the Gospel of Thomas. Forget everything you think you know about Gospels. This one contains no birth story, no miracles, no crucifixion. Instead, it presents Jesus speaking like a spiritual teacher you might meet in a meditation retreat today. Cryptic, profound, challenging you to look within. One saying stops people in their tracks. If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. Hear that again. Let it sink in. This isn't about worshiping someone else's divinity. This is about recognizing your own. This isn't about following rules written by distant authorities. This is about awakening to the truth that's been sleeping inside you all along. How many of us spend our lives looking everywhere else for answers, in books, in teachers, in institutions, when the deepest wisdom might already be written in our hearts? How many of us have felt that spark of something greater within us, only to be told we need an intermediary to reach the divine? The Gnostics believed something revolutionary, that each person carries a piece of the divine within them, and salvation comes through awakening to this inner light, not through fear, not through guilt, through recognition, through remembering who you truly are. This is why these texts were buried. This is why they were called dangerous. Because when people realize their own spiritual power, they stop needing others to tell them how to connect with God. Chapter 2. The Radical Messages of the Gnostic Gospels. Have you ever had a moment where you suddenly felt like you were living someone else's life? Where you looked around at everything you'd been told was important, your job, your possessions, your status, and felt this deep, aching emptiness inside, like you were sleepwalking through a dream that wasn't even your own? The Gnostics knew this feeling intimately. They called it spiritual amnesia, the forgetting of who we truly are. When those ancient texts were pulled from that clay jar in Egypt, they didn't just reveal forgotten history. They exposed a conspiracy of silence that had been hiding the most dangerous truth of all, that you don't need anyone's permission to connect with the divine, that the very essence of God lives inside you right now, waiting to be remembered. But let's back up. Picture this. It's 1945. The world is reeling from the most devastating war in human history. Millions of people are asking the same haunting question. How could supposedly civilized, supposedly Christian nations commit such unspeakable horrors? How could people who attended church every Sunday follow leaders into darkness so complete it defied comprehension? Then, almost as if the universe was responding to humanity's cry for answers, these texts emerge from the desert. And what they revealed was staggering. For over 1,500 years, we'd only been hearing half the story of Christianity. The other half, the mystical, personal, revolutionary half, had been buried literally and figuratively. Think about the timing for a moment. After witnessing the catastrophic results of blind obedience and unquestioned authority, humanity suddenly rediscovered spiritual teachings that said the exact opposite. Question everything, look within, trust your own divine wisdom. Coincidence? I don't think so. But here's where it gets really interesting. After Muhammad found those books, they didn't immediately change the world. They had to survive smugglers, black market dealers, and decades of academic gatekeeping. It wasn't until the 1970s that regular people could finally read these words for themselves. And when they did, it was like lightning in a bottle. Carl Jung, one of the greatest minds of the 20th century, was absolutely fascinated by these texts. He saw in them the same psychological truths he'd been discovering about the human psyche. That we all carry within us both light and shadow, that our journey isn't about perfection, but about integration, about becoming whole. But what exactly did these texts say that was so revolutionary? Imagine if someone told you that everything you think you know about reality is backwards, that this physical world we're so obsessed with, our bodies, our stuff, our social media feeds, is actually the least real thing about us. That there's an entire dimension of existence that's more vivid, more alive, more true than anything you can touch or see. The Gnostics believe that each of us carries within us a spark of pure divine light, not a metaphor, not a nice idea, an actual fragment of the ultimate creative force of the universe. They called it our divine spark, and they believed it was more real than our physical bodies, more permanent than our earthly identities. But here's the problem. We've forgotten. We've become so hypnotized by the material world that we've lost touch with our true nature. It's like being born into a house with no windows and never knowing the sun exists outside. The Gnostic creation story is mind-bending. They taught that reality emerged from an unknowable source of pure consciousness. From this source came emanations of divine beings called aeons. Think of them as aspects of cosmic consciousness like wisdom, truth, and grace. But one of these beings, Sophia, which means wisdom, became curious about the ultimate mystery. She reached too far, trying to understand what couldn't be understood, and in doing so, she accidentally created something flawed. This flawed creation became what they called the demiurge, a kind of false god who didn't realize there were higher realms above him. Thinking he was the ultimate authority, he created our physical universe. And while it has beauty, it's fundamentally limited, like a copy of a copy that gets more distorted with each generation. Now, before you think this sounds too weird or abstract, consider this. Don't you sometimes feel like you're living in a distorted copy of what life should be? Don't you sometimes sense that there's something more real, more meaningful, just beyond your reach? The Gnostics would say that feeling is your divine spark trying to wake you up. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus doesn't sound like the gentle shepherd from Sunday school. He sounds like a spiritual revolutionary, speaking in riddles that crack open conventional thinking. He says things like, "The kingdom is inside of you and it is outside of you. When you come to know yourselves, then you will become known, and you will realize that you are the children of the living Father." Read that again. He's not saying worship me. He's saying wake up and remember who you are. Or this one. If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. How many people do you know who are slowly dying inside because they're not expressing their authentic selves? How many are trapped in jobs, relationships, or lifestyles that don't reflect their true nature? The Gnostics would say this isn't just unfortunate, it's spiritually devastating. But perhaps the most revolutionary text of all is the Gospel of Mary. Here, Mary Magdalene isn't just a reformed prostitute or a devoted follower. She's portrayed as the disciple who truly understood Jesus' deepest teachings. She speaks about the soul's journey through different levels of reality, shedding illusions and attachments until it returns to its divine source. And here's the kicker. Peter, representing the institutional church, gets angry at her insights. He can't accept that a woman might have spiritual authority. Sound familiar? How many times throughout history have women's spiritual experiences been dismissed, minimized, or erased entirely? The Gospel of Philip goes even further, suggesting that Mary Magdalene was Jesus' spiritual equal, his beloved companion in ways that made the other disciples uncomfortable. It presents the ultimate spiritual. Chapter 3. Rediscovering the Hidden Gospels. Have you ever woken up from a dream so vivid that for a moment you couldn't tell which world was real? That disorienting feeling when your dream life felt more authentic than your waking hours? What if I told you that the Gnostics believed our entire physical reality might be that kind of dream? Beautiful, convincing, but not the deepest truth about who we are. Right now, as you listen to these words, you're living in the aftermath of one of history's greatest cover-ups. Not a political conspiracy, but something far more personal. The systematic burial of spiritual teachings that could have changed how you see yourself, how you understand your purpose, and how you connect with the divine. Think about this. Before Christianity became the religion of emperors and cathedrals, before it became about rules and guilt and perfect attendance, it was something else entirely. It was wild, experimental, deeply personal. Imagine spiritual communities where people didn't just believe in God, they experienced direct communion with divine consciousness, where salvation wasn't something you earned through good behavior, but something you awakened to through inner knowing. These weren't fringe cults or deluded mystics. These were serious spiritual seekers who looked at the world around them and asked the question that haunts us all. If God is all-loving and all-powerful, why does life feel so broken? Why do good people suffer? Why does evil seem to triumph? Why do we feel so disconnected from the very source that created us? Their answer was revolutionary. They said, what if the problem isn't with us and it's not with God? What if the problem is that we're trapped in a counterfeit reality created by a being who thinks he's God, but is actually just a confused architect building a flawed universe? I know this sounds like science fiction, but stay with me. The Gnostics called this false creator the demiurge, not evil, just tragically limited, like a child playing with building blocks, creating elaborate structures while completely unaware of the vast world beyond his playroom. And we, according to this vision, are divine sparks of the true God, temporarily imprisoned in his creation, suffering from cosmic amnesia about our real identity. Does this resonate with anything you felt? That sense that you're capable of so much more than your circumstances allow? That feeling of homesickness for a place you've never been? That intuition that there's a deeper reality just beyond the veil of everyday experience? The Gnostics would say those feelings aren't random, they're your soul remembering. But here's where it gets personal. In our modern world, we don't talk about the demiurge, but don't we live under similar delusions? How many of us are trapped in systems that promise fulfillment but deliver emptiness? How many chase success, approval, and security, only to find ourselves more anxious and disconnected than ever? Consider your daily life. How much of it is spent pursuing things that you've been told will make you happy, but somehow never do? Social media validation, material possessions, career achievements, aren't these often just more sophisticated versions of what the Gnostics called illusion? The ancient Gnostics believed that most people sleepwalk through life, hypnotized by the material world, never realizing they carry within them a spark of infinite consciousness. They taught that awakening wasn't about following external rules or pleasing distant authorities. It was about turning inward, questioning everything, and discovering the divine light that was never actually separate from you. This is why their teachings were considered so dangerous. If people realized they didn't need intermediaries to reach God, what would happen to religious power structures? If they understood that salvation came through personal awakening rather than institutional obedience, how could they be controlled? So these teachings were labeled heretical, their books burned, their voices silenced. But consciousness can't be destroyed. Truth has a way of surviving, waiting underground like seeds through winter, ready to bloom when the conditions are right. And maybe those conditions are right now. Maybe in our age of information overload and spiritual hunger, of connection without intimacy and knowledge without wisdom, we're finally ready to hear what the Gnostics whispered 2,000 years ago. You are not who you think you are. You're not just a biological accident struggling through a meaningless universe. You're a fragment of divine consciousness, temporarily wearing a human costume, here to remember your true nature and help others do the same. The question isn't whether this is literally true. The question is, does it awaken something in you? Does it help explain that restless feeling that there's more to existence than what meets the eye? Does it give you permission to trust your deepest spiritual intuitions, even when they don't fit into conventional religious boxes? Because if it does, then you're ready to hear the rest of their story. Chapter 4: The Gnostic View of Jesus and the Soul. What if everything you've been taught about Jesus was designed to keep you small? What if the most radical teacher in human history wasn't asking you to worship him, but to become like him? Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. You're sitting in a circle with other seekers. And this extraordinary teacher looks directly into your soul and says, stop looking for God out there. Stop begging for salvation from someone else. The kingdom of heaven isn't a place you go when you die. It's a reality you can access right now by remembering who you truly are. How would that change everything? This is the Jesus the Gnostics knew. Not the suffering figure nailed to a cross, carrying the weight of everyone's sins. Not the distant savior you're supposed to worship from afar, but a revolutionary spiritual guide whose entire message was, wake up, you are already divine, you just forgot. Think about how radical this is. In a world where people are taught to feel guilty, ashamed, and fundamentally flawed, here was a teacher saying the exact opposite. You're not broken. You're not a sinner in need of rescue. You're a spark of infinite consciousness that temporarily forgot its own light. But here's what makes this even more powerful. The Gnostic Jesus didn't speak in commandments or rigid doctrines. He spoke in riddles, in questions that cracked open conventional thinking. Like a spiritual therapist, he guided people to their own discoveries rather than telling them what to believe. Imagine having a teacher who never said, "This is the truth, accept it." Instead, he asked questions like, "What do you see when you look beyond appearances? What would change if you truly believed you were made of the same essence as the stars?" This wasn't just philosophy. This was practical spirituality for real people living real lives. The Gnostics understood that awakening isn't reserved for saints and mystics living in caves. It's available to anyone willing to do the inner work. The soccer mom questioning why success feels empty. The businessman sensing there's more to existence than profit margins. The student wondering if there's meaning beyond grades and achievement. And here's where the story gets really revolutionary. In these ancient texts, women weren't pushed to the sidelines. Mary Magdalene wasn't just a reformed prostitute or a devoted follower. She was portrayed as one of Jesus's most advanced students, someone who understood his deepest teachings better than the male disciples. Can you imagine how threatening this was? Picture Peter, the supposed rock of the future church, getting jealous because a woman was receiving profound spiritual insights. Picture him saying, essentially, "She can't be that enlightened, she's just a woman." Sound familiar? How many times throughout history have women's spiritual experiences been dismissed, minimized, or erased? How many female voices have been silenced because their insights challenged male authority? But in the Gospel of Mary, something beautiful happens. Mary shares her vision of the soul's journey through different levels of reality, describing how consciousness sheds layers of illusion and attachment until it returns to its divine source. It's like a mystical roadmap for anyone who's ever felt lost in the material world. And what's Peter's response? Confusion, envy. He can't handle that her understanding surpasses his own. This tells us something profound about the nature of spiritual awakening. It doesn't care about your gender, your education, your social status, or your religious background. It only cares about your willingness to look honestly within yourself and question the stories you've been told about who you are. Think about your own life for a moment. How many voices have told you that you're not spiritual enough, not worthy enough, not pure enough to have a direct relationship with the divine? How many institutions have positioned themselves as necessary intermediaries between you and God? The Gnostic vision turns all of that upside down. It says your most authentic spiritual experiences, those moments when you feel connected to something greater, when you sense the mystery and wonder of existence, when you feel love that transcends all boundaries. Those aren't accidents or delusions. They're glimpses of your true nature. You don't need permission to be spiritual. You don't need anyone's approval to seek truth. You don't need to wait for worthiness to connect with the divine source from which you came. The Gnostic Jesus wasn't interested in creating followers. He was interested in creating awakened beings who could recognize their own divine nature and help others do the same. He wasn't building a religion. He was igniting a revolution of consciousness. The question isn't whether you believe in this vision of Jesus. The question is, what would change in your life if you truly believed that you carry within you the same divine spark that illuminated his consciousness? What would shift if you stopped waiting for external salvation and started trusting your own capacity for spiritual awakening? Because maybe that's exactly what the world needs right now. Not more people worshiping from a distance, but more people remembering their own divine nature and living from that truth. Chapter 5. The Suppression of Gnostic Teachings. Have you ever wondered why some truths feel dangerous? Why certain ideas make power structures nervous? Why throughout history, the most transformative spiritual insights seem to be the first ones banned, burned, or buried? What happened to the Gnostics wasn't just ancient history. It's a pattern that repeats itself whenever ordinary people discover they don't need intermediaries to access the divine. It's the same energy that silences whistleblowers, discredits mystics, and dismisses anyone who dares to say, you have more power than they want you to know. Picture this. You're living in the 2nd century, and you've discovered something that changes everything. You've learned that you don't need a priest to talk to God. You don't need a building to house the sacred. You don't need anyone's permission to explore the deepest mysteries of existence. You're part of a community where women share spiritual visions as equals, where personal revelation matters more than institutional doctrine, where awakening is your birthright. How long do you think the authorities would let this continue? Because here's what the early church leaders realized. If people believe they carry the divine within them, they stop being controllable. If they trust their own spiritual experiences, they stop depending on external validation. If they think salvation comes through inner awakening rather than obedience to religious rules, they become ungovernable. And ungovernable people are dangerous to any system built on control. So the attack began, not with swords or armies, but with something far more insidious, the systematic destruction of ideas. Church fathers like Irenaeus didn't just disagree with Gnostic teachings, they declared war on them. They wrote massive texts branding the Gnostics as heretics, blasphemers, spiritual perverts, seduced by Satan himself. But here's what's heartbreaking. These weren't theological debates between equals. This was David versus Goliath, except David was a small community of mystics, and Goliath was the entire Roman Empire deciding which version of Christianity would become legal. Think about what this means for a moment. The texts that became the New Testament weren't chosen because they were the most spiritual, the most authentic, or the most transformative. They were chosen because they supported a version of Christianity that could serve imperial power. They told people to be obedient, to submit to authority, to wait for salvation rather than claim their own spiritual power. The Gnostic texts, with their radical message of inner divinity and personal awakening, simply didn't fit the agenda of an empire that needed compliant subjects, not empowered mystics. Does this sound familiar? How many times in your own life have you been told that your spiritual experiences don't count unless they're validated by official sources? How often have you been made to feel that your direct connection to the sacred is somehow less legitimate than institutional teachings? The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD was the final nail in the coffin. Picture a room full of bishops called together by Emperor Constantine, not because he was spiritual, but because he needed religious unity to maintain political control. These men, most of whom had never had a mystical experience in their lives, sat around tables, deciding which spiritual truths humanity would be allowed to hear. And what did they decide? That the version of Christianity that emphasized hierarchy, obedience, and institutional authority would become law. The version that said ordinary people could access divine truth directly? Banned, heretical, dangerous. It's like having a committee of politicians decide which songs you're allowed to sing, which dreams you're permitted to have, which parts of your soul you're allowed to explore. But here's where the story gets both tragic and beautiful. The Gnostics knew what was coming. They could see their world closing in around them. So what did they do? They didn't fight with weapons. They didn't start a revolution. Instead, they did something profoundly hopeful. They buried their most precious texts in clay jars and hid them in desert caves, trusting that someday, in a more enlightened age, someone would find them. Can you imagine that level of faith? Can you picture those ancient mystics facing the complete destruction of their spiritual community, carefully wrapping their sacred writings and burying them like time capsules, believing that truth would eventually resurface? They were essentially sending a message across 16 centuries. We know you're out there. We know someday people will be ready to hear what we've learned. Hold on, the truth survives. And they were right. In 1945, when Muhammad al-Saman's shovel hit that clay jar, it wasn't just an archaeological discovery. It was the universe keeping a promise made centuries earlier by people who refused to let spiritual truth die. But the suppression didn't end in ancient times. Even today, how many spiritual seekers are told their experiences aren't valid unless they fit within approved religious frameworks? How many people doubt their own mystical encounters because they don't match institutional teachings? The same forces that buried the Gnostic Gospels are still at work, not through book burnings and exile, but through subtler forms of spiritual gatekeeping. The message is still the same. You need us to reach God. You can't trust your own spiritual experiences. Salvation comes through our institution, not through your awakening. But what if the Gnostics were right? What if the divine spark within you is more real than any external authority? What if your capacity for direct spiritual experience is exactly what some systems fear most? The clay jars are open now. The texts have been translated. The secret is out. The question is, are you ready to claim the spiritual power that someone spent centuries trying to hide from you? Because that's what this is really about. Not ancient history, but your right to spiritual self-determination. your right to trust your own connection to the sacred, your right to awaken without asking anyone's permission. The Gnostics bet their lives that this truth would survive. The least we can do is listen. Chapter 6: Gnostic Wisdom in the Modern World. What if the answers you've been searching for your entire life were never lost, just buried under centuries of lies about where to look for them? Right now, as you scroll through your phone, looking for meaning in other people's highlight reels, as you chase the next promotion, hoping it will finally make you feel worthy, as you lie awake at 3 a.m., wondering if this is all there is, somewhere deep inside, a voice is whispering the same truth the Gnostics died protecting. You're looking in all the wrong places. Think about this. We live in the most connected age in human history. Yet loneliness is an epidemic. We have access to more information than any generation before us. Yet wisdom feels more elusive than ever. We can buy anything we want with a single click. Yet satisfaction remains perpetually out of reach. The Gnostics would say this isn't a coincidence. It's the natural result of a world that has forgotten the most fundamental truth about human existence. Everything you're seeking outside yourself already lives within you. But here's what makes their message so dangerous in our modern world. It doesn't just challenge religious institutions, it challenges every system built on the lie that you're incomplete, that you need something external to be whole. The advertising industry, the self-help complex, the political machines that run on your dissatisfaction, they all depend on you never discovering your own divine nature. Imagine what would happen to consumer culture if people suddenly realized they were already complete. What would happen to social media if users stopped needing external validation? What would happen to fear-based politics if citizens remembered their inherent power and worth? This is why these ancient texts feel so urgent today. Every time you mindlessly scroll, desperately seeking something to fill the void, you're experiencing what the Gnostics called spiritual amnesia. Every time you achieve a goal and still feel empty, you're bumping up against the truth they whispered. The material world, no matter how beautifully packaged, can never satisfy a soul that remembers its divine origin. Carl Jung, one of the greatest minds of the 20th century, was obsessed with these texts because he recognized something profound. The journey they described, descending into your shadow, confronting your illusions, integrating all parts of yourself, wasn't just ancient mythology. It was a psychological roadmap that every human being must travel to become whole. But here's what's beautiful. You don't need to believe in their cosmology to benefit from their wisdom. Whether you're Christian, Buddhist, atheist, or somewhere in between, the core insight remains the same. The prison is in your mind. The key is in your heart. And the freedom you seek has been with you all along. Every meditation teacher telling you to look within. Every therapist helping you uncover your authentic self. Every moment of presence when you suddenly feel connected to something greater. They're all echoing what these ancient mystics knew. Awakening isn't about acquiring something new. It's about remembering something eternal. The question isn't whether the Gnostic Gospels are historically accurate or theologically correct. The question is, are you tired of searching for yourself in all the wrong places? Are you ready to stop waiting for permission to trust your own spiritual experiences? Are you prepared to discover that the very thing you've been desperately seeking has been quietly waiting inside you this entire time. Because if you are, then maybe it's time to stop consuming spiritual content and start creating your own direct experience of the divine. Maybe it's time to stop following other people's paths and start trusting the wisdom that's been guiding you all along. The Gnostics buried their texts in clay jars, trusting that someday someone like you would be ready to hear their message. The jars have been opened. The message has been delivered. What you do with it now is entirely up to you.